The Sentient Species Classification Bureau, a bureaucratic nightmare of a department buried in the bowels of the Galactic Confederacy's administrative complex, had one job: categorize every intelligent life form they encountered. And boy, did they love their categories. Apex predator, mid-tier hunter, opportunistic omnivore, specialized herbivore, and at the bottom, prey species. These weren't just academic labels. They determined everything from trading rights to diplomatic protocols to which bathroom you could use at Confederacy headquarters. The Valthrex, with their impressive array of natural weapons, retractable claws that could slice through battle-grade armor, venomous spines that lined their forearms, and jaws that could crush titanium alloys, sat comfortably at the top of this hierarchy. They were designated AP1, the highest apex predator classification. The Valthrex knew it, flaunted it. And the rest of the galaxy's inhabitants had the good sense to acknowledge it with appropriate deference. Humanity, on the other hand, was classified as 007, opportunistic omnivores, subcategory 7, meaning mostly harmless but occasionally unpredictable. The Bureau considered this extremely generous. After all, humans had no natural weapons to speak of. No claws, no venom, laughably dull teeth, and skin so thin a gentle breeze could theoretically lacerate it. The fact that they'd clawed their way, metaphorically of course, since they couldn't literally claw anything, to the stars was considered an administrative oversight by the universe. What the Bureau missed in their meticulous taxonomic work was context. Earth, that unremarkable blue-green planet in an unfashionable spiral arm, was what the Confederacy termed a death world. A planet so aggressively hostile that evolution went into overdrive just to keep pace. The Bureau, in all their wisdom, failed to consider that anything surviving such conditions might be, by definition, more dangerous than it appeared. This oversight was about to become spectacularly evident at the Pan-Galactic Diplomatic Exchange on Neutral Station 6, where representatives from 47 species gathered to discuss revised trade agreements. The humans had sent a junior diplomat, supposedly as a gesture of humility, but more likely because no senior diplomat wanted to waste their time at what promised to be 3 standard cycles of mind-numbing bureaucratic haggling. The Valthrex delegation, led by High Commander ZX Kalon, seemed particularly interested in renegotiating mineral rights in the Orion Spur, a region inconveniently close to human expansion efforts. The atmosphere was already charged when the talks began. By the 3rd hour, it had deteriorated to thinly veiled threats. By hour 5, the translation matrix was struggling to find diplomatic equivalents for what amounted to sophisticated species-based slurs. And that's when everything went spectacularly wrong, in that special way that only the collision of politics, pride, and poor threat assessment can achieve. A way that would make the Classification Bureau reconsider their entire methodology, and cause even the most cynical Confederacy bureaucrat to choke on their stimulant beverage. Lieutenant Elena Kearney, though her Confederacy credentials listed her simply as Diplomatic Attaché Kearney, sat at the far end of the negotiation table, maintaining the pleasant vacant smile that aliens had come to expect from humans. 6 years in naval intelligence, followed by 3 in Special Operations Command, had taught her that being underestimated was a tactical advantage. Her current assignment as a junior translator was the perfect cover for what she actually did: threat assessment and emergency extraction for human diplomatic teams. Not that anyone would suspect this by looking at her. At 5'7", with an athletic but unremarkable build, brown hair pulled back in a regulation-compliant bun, and standard-issue diplomatic attire that somehow managed to be simultaneously formal and forgettable, she blended perfectly into the background. The Valthrex delegation hadn't even acknowledged her presence when they entered, their attention reserved for Ambassador Rodriguez, the official human representative. High Commander Zex Kalorn led the Valthrex contingent, his 9-foot frame dominating the room, not just physically but energetically. His scales shifted between deep crimson and burnished gold depending on the lighting, a biological feature that humans might find beautiful if it weren't for the evolutionary purpose, a warning display to potential prey. The commander's personal guard, Drevmakta, stood behind him, somehow managing to look bored and threatening simultaneously, his claws rhythmically extending and retracting in what Elena recognized as a stress response, rather than the intimidation display the other species perceived. The human expansion into the Orion Spur violates the spirit of the Proxima Accords. Zex Kalorn's translator module rendered his series of clicks and growls into standard galactic. We have historical hunting rights to those systems dating back 17 generations. Ambassador Rodriguez, a career diplomat with 30 years of experience navigating extraterrestrial politics, maintained his composure. With respect, Commander, the Proxima Accords specifically address inhabited systems. Our surveys confirmed these planets are uninhabited, placing them under the Frontier Development Statute. The Jarkiv representative, a methane breather whose containment suit hissed with each agitated movement, interjected. Perhaps if the humans surrendered mining rights in the outer systems as a gesture of good faith, the Valthrek's cultural claims could be honored while maintaining human colonization efforts. Elena watched as Rodriguez's left eyebrow twitched slightly, his tell when he was about to concede ground. She tapped a note on her datapad that flashed on his screen. Jarkiv has defense contract with Valthrex, not neutral party. The ambassador adjusted course seamlessly. An interesting proposal, but our records show the Jarkiv conglomerate recently signed a resource-sharing agreement with the Valthrex Dominion. Perhaps another neutral party could offer mediation? The chamber erupted in overlapping translation feeds as multiple species attempted to position themselves as the reasonable middle ground. Elena used the commotion to observe the other players. The Krith delegation, insectoids with a reputation for opportunism, were chittering excitedly. The Wellorians, gas bladder philosophers who literally floated above conflicts, had risen nearly a meter higher in the room, a sign of their discomfort. Most concerning was the Valthrex guard, whose scales had darkened to a deep burgundy at the temples, a precursor to aggressive action she'd read about but never witnessed. The humans bring primitive deception to these sacred halls, Zex Kalorn suddenly roared, slamming a clawed appendage on the table hard enough to crack its polished surface. The translation came through, but Eleanor didn't need it. Body language transcended species boundaries when it reached this level of aggression. Ambassador Rodriguez remained impressively calm. Commander, I assure you, your assurances are as worthless as your species' contribution to galactic civilization. The Valthrex leader cut him off. You send a senior diplomat with no authority to make concessions and a junior female with no purpose whatsoever. This insults the Dominion. Elena noticed the security forces, a mixed species unit considered neutral, shifting uncomfortably. They were supposed to prevent violence, but nobody wanted to be the first to confront an enraged Valthrex. The room's atmosphere had transformed from tense diplomacy to something far more dangerous, and she calculated at least 6 different ways the situation could deteriorate in the next 90 seconds. The breaking point came when Rodriguez stood to call for a recess. Zex Kalorn misinterpreted the movement as a challenge, or perhaps used it as an excuse. With shocking speed for his size, the commander flipped the massive table, sending datapads and translation devices flying. In the same fluid motion, he seized Rodriguez by the throat, lifting the human ambassador as easily as a child might lift a doll. Perhaps, the Valthrex snarled, the Dominion should simply take what is rightfully ours. Chaos erupted in the diplomatic chamber. The security forces froze in that special way that only comes from complete procedural failure. Their training had covered disruptive delegates and even minor altercations, but an apex predator holding a sentient being aloft by the throat, that particular scenario had been optimistically omitted from the manual. Confederation security protocols have been violated, announced the room's automated system with all the emotional urgency of someone discussing mild weather. Please remain calm while containment measures are implemented. The containment measures turned out to be disappointingly inadequate, the exit sealed with a pneumatic hiss, trapping everyone inside with the enraged Valthrex. Stellar job, security designers. A+ work. Ambassador Rodriguez dangled from Zex Kalorn's grip, his face turning an interesting shade of purple that human medical professionals would find concerning and alien xenobiologists would find fascinating. The Valthrex commander's guard, Drev Makta, moved with practiced efficiency, positioning himself between the security forces and his superior. His body underwent a remarkable transformation. Dermal plates that had lain flat against his skin now raised like organic armor. and the specialized hunting quills along his spine extended to their full, impressive length. "The Dominion will no longer tolerate human expansion," Zexkelorn announced, giving Rodriguez a shake for emphasis. The ambassador made a sound reminiscent of a squeaky toy being stepped on. "We claim the disputed territories by right of strength. Your diplomatic protests mean nothing when you send weak representatives who cannot even defend themselves." Elena remained seated, her posture unchanged, which the Velthrax interpreted as the frozen terror of prey. A reasonable assumption for a species whose evolutionary response to threats was fight or eat something even more threatening. The other delegates had retreated to the walls, creating maximum distance between themselves and the unfolding disaster. The Wellorians had somehow managed to flatten their gas bladders enough to press themselves against the ceiling. "The female stays where she is," Drevrakta ordered when one of the security officers made a subtle movement toward Elena. "The rest of you, surrender your weapons and communication devices." The security team complied with the enthusiasm of people who recognized they were dramatically outmatched. Their standard-issue stunners, calibrated for most oxygen-breathing species, would barely give a Valtrex a mild tingling sensation, an outcome the department euphemistically termed suboptimal incapacitation. Divmakta's transformation continued as he collected the surrendered weapons. The segmented ridges along his forearms split open, revealing glistening barbed tendrils that could inject paralyzing toxins. His jaw unhinged slightly, displaying 4 rows of serrated teeth evolved specifically for shearing through the armored exoskeletons of prehistoric prey on the Valthrex homeworld. Most impressive, or terrifying depending on your perspective, were the specialized hunting organs on his palms. Circular structures ringed with retractable claws and centered around adhesive pads that could attach to and immobilize struggling prey. "Our ship will arrive shortly to extract us," Zexkelorn announced. "The human ambassador will accompany us as insurance against interference. The Dominion will communicate our new terms once we are safely away." The Krith delegation's representative, apparently experiencing a catastrophic failure of self-preservation instincts, chittered nervously. "The Confederation will never recognize terms negotiated under duress." Rev Mactor silenced the insectoid with a warning display so primal it transcended species boundaries. His neck frills expanded to triple their normal size, revealing iridescent patterns that pulsed with hypnotic intensity. An evolutionary adaptation designed to mesmerize prey before the kill. The Krith representative immediately fell silent and began producing a high-pitched keening sound that his translator diplomatically declined to interpret. Throughout this escalating hostage situation, Elena remained motionless, her expression unchanged. This apparent paralysis with fear only reinforced the Valthrex's confidence. Every other being in the room was displaying their species' panic response. The Jarkiv's methane mixture had shifted to include stress pheromones so potent they were fogging their containment suits. The Wellorians had lost buoyancy control and were bobbing erratically near the ceiling, and even the stoic security chief was making small, involuntary swallowing movements. "You," Zexkelorn finally addressed Eleanor directly, female translator. "Contact your ship. Tell them to prepare for our departure with the ambassador." Elena looked up, her expression still unnervingly calm. Then she did something that confused every evolutionary instinct in the room. She smiled. "Second one." Elena's smile remained fixed as her mind kicked into combat assessment mode. The room's dimensions, exit points, and threat locations mapped themselves in her consciousness with practiced precision. 6 years of naval intelligence hadn't just taught her to gather information, it had taught her to weaponize it. Second two. She recalled Captain Nguyen's favorite training maxim: "Your greatest advantage is that they don't know what you are." The captain had been referring to undercover operations, but the principle applied perfectly to interspecies confrontations. The Confederation database listed Valthrak's maximum grip strength at 1,200 psi, enough to crush human bone. Rodriguez had approximately 90 seconds before tracheal collapse. Second three. Her eyes flicked to Drevmakta's position, calculating distances and angles. The guard's transformation had completed, his biology now optimized for combat. 3 major vulnerabilities remained: the exposed sensory cluster at the base of the skull, the unarmored joint where his primary limbs connected to the torso, and the throat sac that regulated his body temperature. Second 4. Flashback to the Deathworld survival course. Module 7, Apex Predator Psychology. The instructor, a grizzled veteran missing 2 fingers and sporting a scar that twisted his face into a permanent half-grimace, paced before the class. They expect submission from prey. The moment you don't follow the script is the moment you gain tactical advantage. Confusion creates opportunity. Second 5. Elena's right hand drifted casually toward her diplomatic credential case. The Valthrex hadn't bothered to collect it. After all, what threat could human identification possibly pose? The fools hadn't realized that Special Operations Command had long ago perfected the art of disguising weapons as mundane objects. The credential case contained a compressed ceramic blade that wouldn't register on standard security scans. Second 6. She catalogued the positions of the other delegates. None were physical threats, but some might interfere out of misguided heroism or panic. The Wellorians near the ceiling could potentially drop onto combatants, probably accidentally, given their typical non-violent philosophy. But physics didn't care about philosophical intentions when it delivered kinetic energy. Second 7, another flashback, the kill house exercise where she'd faced a simulated Valthrex for the first time. She'd hesitated for 1.3 seconds, enough time for the training dummy to kill her 3 times over. The instructor had been merciless. Kearney, in the field, you won't get a second chance to die. Their reflexes are faster, their strength greater. You have exactly one advantage. They don't think you're a threat until it's too late. Second 8. She noted the subtle shifts in Zexcalorn's stance. Weight distributed unevenly, center of gravity compromised by the dangling ambassador. Classic predator overconfidence. His species evolved to overwhelm with superior strength, not to guard against unexpected counterattacks. Second 9. Rodriguez's eyes met hers, and understanding passed between them. The ambassador, despite his diplomatic training and oxygen-deprived brain, recognized the shift in her demeanor. His hand moved slightly, fingers spreading in what would appear to aliens as a futile gesture, but was actually Alliance military hand code for ready on your mark. Second 10. She considered and discarded 14 different attack sequences, settling on the optimal approach. Primary objective, free the ambassador. Secondary, neutralize immediate threats. Tertiary, secure the room. Predicted success probability 68.3%. Not ideal, but acceptable given the circumstances. Second 11. The room hung suspended in that peculiar tension unique to moments before violence erupts. Every being present sensed something had changed, though none could articulate what. The Krith had stopped their stress keening. The Jarkiv's breathing apparatus cycled faster. The security officers' postures subtly shifted. Even the Wellorians descended a few centimeters, their gas bladders contracting with anticipation. Second 12. Elena's smile widened fractionally as she made her decision. The Valthrex interpreted this as submission, the final acceptance of prey before the inevitable end. They couldn't have been more wrong. In their evolutionary history, nothing that smiled at them had ever been dangerous. That was about to change. Elena stood, the movement so smooth and unhurried that it read as surrender rather than attack. Drevmakta's attention remained fixed on the security officers. A critical error. By the time the guard registered the change in her position, she had already drawn the ceramic blade from her credentials case and sent it spinning through the air. The blade struck with surgical precision, embedding itself in Zexacaron's exposed throat sac. Not deep enough to kill, Eleanor was still operating under diplomatic protocols that prioritized non-lethal solutions, but perfectly placed to trigger an autonomic response. The commander's temperature regulation system went haywire, and his grip on Ambassador Rodriguez reflexively loosened. What? Was all Zexcalorn managed, before Rodriguez dropped from his grasp, crumpling to the floor in an undignified heap that would absolutely not be mentioned in his official report of the incident. Drevmakta reacted with the speed expected of an apex predator, but he made the classic mistake of predicting human movement based on the biomechanics of species he'd encountered before. He lunged for where Elena should have been, slashing through empty air as she ducked under his reach and executed a combat roll that would have earned appreciative nods from her special operations instructors. Containment breach detected, the room's automated system announced, with the same level of concern it might use to report a minor temperature fluctuation. Security protocols elevated to level 3. The overhead lighting shifted to a pulsing amber, which did absolutely nothing to resolve the situation, but certainly added dramatic flair to the unfolding violence. The Confederation's emergency response designers clearly understood aesthetics better than practical security measures. Elena reached Rodriguez, dragging him toward the relative safety of the overturned negotiation table. The ambassador, to his credit, was already recovering, his diplomatic training evidently including a module on how not to be completely useless during a crisis. "Stay down," she told him, then addressed the room at large. "Confederation Diplomatic Protection Protocol 17B is now in effect. All delegates are advised to remain in place." This was, of course, complete nonsense. No such protocol existed, but bureaucracy-loving aliens didn't know that, and the authoritative tone bought her precious seconds as they all tried to recall the details of an imaginary regulation. Drev MacDur recovered from his initial miscalculation and circled more cautiously now, his predatory instincts recalibrating. "The female has combat training," he snarled to his commander, who was still struggling with the blade in his throat sac. "Unexpected, you don't say," Elena replied dryly, positioning herself between the Volthrex and the ambassador. "Would you like to know what else you've miscalculated?" The guard's hunting quills bristled in response to the challenge. An intimidation display that would have sent most prey species into panic. Elena, however, had spent 3 months studying Valthrex biology. Those raised quills created a momentary blind spot in the predator's peripheral vision. She used it, moving with explosive speed that belied human limitations. Elena launched herself forward, not away as instinct would dictate. She slid beneath the guard's slashing claws and drove a precision strike into the unarmored joint where his primary limb connected to his torso. The Valthrex equivalent of a rotator cuff tore with a satisfying pop. The other delegates watched in stunned silence. The Krith representative's mandibles clicked rapidly in what the translation system rendered as, "What the actual?" Untranslatable expletive. Drav Maktor howled, a sound that triggered primal fear responses in most of the room's occupants. The Wellorians deflated so rapidly that 2 of them pancaked against the floor. The security officers, trained to respond to threats, found themselves frozen in confusion as their threat assessment algorithms tried to process a scenario where a supposed prey species was systematically dismantling an apex predator. Zexkalorn finally extracted the blade from his throat sac, flinging it aside with a roar. "Kill her!" he commanded, his voice distorted by damaged vocal structures. Elena smiled again, that same disconcerting expression that had preceded the violence. "Commander, you're operating under several critical misconceptions. First, that your evolutionary advantages translate to combat superiority. They don't. Second, that humans are prey. We're not." She punctuated this statement by evading another lunge from Drev Maktor, using his momentum to guide him into a collision with the chamber wall. The impact cracked the reinforced material and dazed the guard momentarily. "You see," Eleanor continued conversationally, as though discussing trade policies rather than actively fighting, "humans didn't evolve as apex predators. We evolved as persistence predators. We're not the strongest or the fastest, but we are absolutely the most stubborn species in the galaxy." Zexkalorn charged, forsaking his usual calculated approach for raw aggression. Eleanor sidestepped with millimeters to spare, allowing his claws to shred the sleeve of her diplomatic uniform rather than her arm. As he passed, she drove a precision strike to the base of his skull, directly into the exposed sensory cluster, a vulnerability documented in classified Confederation xenobiology reports, but considered impossible to exploit due to the speed and strength advantages of the Valthrex. The commander staggered, his neurological system temporarily overwhelmed. His massive frame swayed precariously as contradictory signals flooded his brain. "The third misconception," Eleanor continued, her breathing controlled despite the exertion, "is that your natural weapons are superior to our learned ones. You rely on evolution. We rely on innovation and adaptation. Throughout the chamber, translators struggled to keep pace with her words, while simultaneously rendering the various sounds of shock and disbelief emanating from the delegates. The Jarkiv representative's containment suit had completely fogged over with stress pheromones, rendering them effectively blind, but probably happier that way. Drev Makto recovered and rejoined the fight, but his movements had lost their fluid coordination. He and Zexkalorn attempted to flank Elena, but their Gongji Mushi, traditional pack hunting techniques, were ineffective against her unconventional movements. She didn't react like prey. She didn't even react like a predator. She moved like something their evolutionary psychology had never encountered and could not process. And the final misconception, Elena said, executing a spinning maneuver that positioned both Valthrax in her line of sight, is that diplomatic training and combat training are mutually exclusive skill sets. With a series of strikes too fast for non-human eyes to track, she targeted nerve clusters and pressure points mapped out in xenobiology files that were definitely not supposed to be accessible to junior diplomatic staff. Drev Maktor collapsed first, his legs buckling as motor control failed. Zexkalorn remained upright through sheer rage-fueled determination, but his movements had devolved into sluggish, uncoordinated swipes. The security officers finally overcame their paralysis and moved to contain the situation, though their assistance was clearly superfluous at this point. One of them tapped his communication device. "Central, we have an unusual situation in Diplomatic Chamber 3. Zexkalorn, his biological weapons rendered useless and his pride in tatters, dropped to one knee. Then, in the ultimate acknowledgement of defeat, he deliberately lowered his ceremonial weapon to the ground. 12 seconds of silence had preceded the violence. 12 seconds of combat had ended it. The diplomatic chamber remained perfectly silent for approximately 18 seconds after Zexkalorn surrendered. A new record for a room full of professional talking entities whose entire careers revolved around never shutting up. The Confederation security team moved with newfound efficiency to secure the Valthrex delegates, though their sidelong glances at Elena suggested they were equally concerned about the need to secure her. "Medical assistance for the ambassador?" Elena requested, helping Rodriguez to a chair that had somehow remained upright during the chaos. The ambassador's neck displayed impressive bruising that would undoubtedly feature prominently in his future diplomatic war stories, though probably with increasingly heroic embellishments as the years passed. The Jarkiv representative was the first to break the stunned silence. "That was unexpected." Their translator module struggled to convey the complex mixture of fear, confusion, and reluctant admiration in their voice. "I would suggest," Ambassador Rodriguez rasped, massaging his throat, "that we reschedule today's negotiations. Perhaps with revised parameters regarding the Orion Spur territories." The Krith delegates' mandibles clicked rapidly. "The consortium would be amenable to serving as neutral mediators in these discussions," they offered, their earlier criticism of the Valthrex conveniently forgotten. Nothing like witnessing violence to clarify one's diplomatic priorities. As medical personnel attended to Rodriguez and security processed the Valthrex delegates, the other representatives maintained a respectful distance from Elena. The invisible bubble of space around her had expanded from the standard human diplomatic radius to something more appropriate for an unexploded ordnance. "Your credentials," the security chief said stiffly, approaching with the caution of someone addressing an unfamiliar explosive device, "did not indicate combat training." Elena straightened her torn uniform sleeve with mild annoyance. "My credentials indicate exactly what the diplomatic corps deemed necessary for interspecies negotiation. If you have concerns about their thoroughness, I suggest filing Form GC-7291-EB with the Administrative Review Board." She delivered this bureaucratic death sentence with the faintest hint of a smile. The Willarians, having reinflated to their normal buoyancy, descended cautiously to conversational level. "We have studied human history extensively, yet this capability was unanticipated," their eldest commented. "Gas sacs pulsing with agitation." "That's rather the point," Elena replied, accepting a repair patch for her uniform from a wide-eyed assistant. "Humanity evolved on a death world where most things could and would kill us. We weren't the strongest, fastest, or most naturally armed species. We couldn't compete as apex predators, so we adapted differently. She applied the patch with practiced ease while continuing her impromptu xenoanthropology lecture. We became persistence hunters. We followed prey until they collapsed from exhaustion because we could regulate our body temperature through sweating, something most species can't do. We developed pattern recognition so sophisticated that we can extract meaning from the slightest environmental changes. And, most importantly, we became incredibly good at watching predators and learning their weaknesses. The Krith representative chittered nervously. You studied our weaknesses? Of course, Elena replied with such casual indifference that several delegates took involuntary steps backward. That's what prey species do to survive. Except humans took it further. We didn't just learn to avoid predators. We learned to become something new entirely. Not prey, not predator, but something that understands both and can adapt accordingly. The room's automated system announced the arrival of a diplomatic security detachment from the human embassy, their timing impeccably useless now that the crisis had been resolved. Elena acknowledged them with a nod before turning back to the assembled delegates. The Valthrex made a fundamental error in their assessment. They classified us as weak, based on superficial physical characteristics, because that's how their evolutionary history taught them to evaluate threats. But intelligence and adaptability don't show up on physical scans, Ambassador Rodriguez, his voice slightly recovered, added, "Perhaps this incident provides an opportunity to reconsider certain classification parameters within the Confederacy structure." The security chief, having witnessed the systematic dismantling of apex predators by what his training had categorized as a minimal threat, could only nod weakly. His subsequent report would undoubtedly include several pointed recommendations about updating the threat assessment protocols for human diplomatic staff. As the chamber gradually returned to some semblance of order, the Jarkiv representative approached Elena with uncharacteristic directness. "Your species is categorized incorrectly in the Sentient Species Classification Bureau records," Elena shrugged, the gesture deliberately casual. "Bureaucratic oversight happens all the time, not an oversight," the Jarkiv insisted, their methane mix cycling rapidly with stress. "A catastrophic error in fundamental assessment methodology." "Well," Eleanor replied, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear with the same hand that had just incapacitated 2 apex predators, "I'm sure the Classification Bureau will review their procedures. Bureaucracy moves slowly, but it does move." The look exchanged between the delegates suggested that the Bureau would be moving considerably faster than usual on this particular matter. 3 standard cycles after what diplomatic records euphemistically termed the Neutral Station 6 incident, the Sentient Species Classification Bureau issued a rare emergency reclassification notice. Humans were upgraded from 007, opportunistic omnivores, subcategory 7, mostly harmless but occasionally unpredictable, to a newly created classification, AP Never Know, Apex Predator, subcategory 0, deceptively non-threatening appearance with extreme adaptive capacity. The Bureau, in an unprecedented display of bureaucratic self-preservation, scrambled to rewrite millennia of taxonomic methodology to accommodate a species that had the audacity to evolve without following the standard galactic template. The revision committee reportedly went through 17 distinct mental breakdowns and 32 pots of stimulant beverage before producing a classification framework that could encompass a species simultaneously lacking obvious predatory features while demonstrating apex-level threat capacity. Most remarkably, the Valthrex Dominion voluntarily withdrew their claims to the disputed territories in the Orion Spur, citing revised resource allocation priorities, rather than acknowledging they'd been thoroughly outmaneuvered both diplomatically and physically. Their representatives now insisted on full-spectrum scanning of all human diplomatic personnel and maintained a minimum safe distance of 5 meters during negotiations. Throughout the galaxy, the prevailing wisdom regarding humanity underwent a subtle but profound shift. Species that had previously dismissed humans as soft, weak curiosities now studied human history with newfound interest, particularly the uncomfortable pattern of humans repeatedly defeating technologically or physically superior opponents throughout their bloody planetary history. The universe, it seemed, had been reminded of a principle so fundamental that even the most sophisticated sentients occasionally forgot it. Never judge a species by the weapons you can see, but by the history that forged them. and humanity's history had forged something the galaxy had never encountered before. Predators that thought like prey, and prey that killed like predators. 12 seconds of silence had changed the course of interstellar diplomacy forever. The Classification Bureau, to its credit, eventually added a warning label to humanity's file. It read simply, "Caution, appearance does not correlate with threat level. Approach with appropriate respect or not at all." It was, perhaps, the most accurate classification they had ever made.